Hello and welcome to another episode of The Lion's Den. Today we are going to be talking about how to really prep your Stormlance Dark Angels. So sort of trying to peek behind the curtain of my mindset and how I like to play to try and get the most out of my Dark Angels army. So A, if you're playing me soon, click off this video immediately. I don't want you watching it. And B, hopefully if you're a Dark Angels player and you're still here, then you will enjoy this. So first of all, I just want to kind of frame what we're going to be talking about, which is why would you want to play Dark Angels? Now, I think a lot of people want to play Dark Angels because of the lore. They are very cool. The whole like knight aesthetic, the Deep Dark Secret kind of with the Fallen, obviously the original The Dark Angel by Lionel Johnson, subtext there as well. I personally find that quite fun. So like there's lots of different things that might make you want to play Dark Angels, but why would you settle on Dark Angels as a competitive army? Now, this is obviously subject to change, and this is incredibly different in 10th edition because you can play so many different detachments. And obviously, we're talking about Stormlance Dark Angels, which is ultimately White Scars Dark Angels, rather than like a traditional Dark Angel detachment, because unfortunately in their current state they're just not quite good enough to compete at those top tables. So this video is very much specific to Dark Angels in Stormlance. That is what I've been getting my sort of most success. There are successful Gladius builds out there. There are definitely more shooty variants, so if that's your thing, or if you are playing on more open terrain, then absolutely an option there. However, what I'm going to focus on is Stormlance. And the reason that I opt for Stormlance in particular is because it's a combat army with that shooting element to it as well. It's able to cover those bases, sort of punishing your opponent for early missteps, where if you take something like World Eaters, obviously you can kind of deploy as you wish as long as you've got, an infiltrating unit scout blocking them. Obviously it has changed a little bit with Goremongers, but, that is by the by. And then you don't have to respect getting sort of shot by them because they're not a shooting army. However, when you go up against Stormlance, you expect to see something like Triple Ballistus or Triple Predator Destructor. In slightly more niche cases, you might even see some Vindicators as well. I really like those long-range shooting elements because they keep your opponent honest. So I like having the best of both worlds of that really hard-hitting World Eater style shock attack alongside the shooting element that you can bring in with those more traditional Space Marine data sheets like your Predator Destructor, like your Ballistus Dreadnought, because I think they really bring like a positive style to that list to be able to kind of deal with those threats that you don't really want to engage in combat. Now, another thing that I really like about this Dark Angels is it's very aggressive and it's very early scoring. It likes to put pressure on your opponent, sort of get right in their face, get that board dominance, and then leverage that to sort of push out the rest of the game. And oftentimes you don't actually have to win those engagements if you're able to win that board presence. If you can force your opponent to sort of stay in their deployment zone or just battle on those areas of the battlefield that you're less bothered about, off objectives, etc., then you're able to just build an unassailable score. And sure, your opponent can go, well, in turns 6 and 7, I've tabled you. And it's like, yes, you would have. But we only played to turn 5, so that's a really handy element of this Dark Angels army. It's just incredibly efficient at scoring its points, having units in the right places to punish your opponent, while also forcing them to think about their positioning from either that long-range threat or the fear of a long advance and charge, sort of getting a lot of Deathwing Knights into their lines and punishing them for slightly sloppy movement. Then next, the final and the real element that I really like is the high pressure stat check nature of Dark Angels. A lot of the time when you go up to an opponent, they'll go, I don't know how to beat 15 Deathwing Knights, or I don't know how to kill 15 Deathwing Knights. Ultimately, that is the same in my mind as someone going, I don't know how to kill 13 War Dogs, which is a stat check list. Now, obviously, we're not all Deathwing Knights. As much as I would love it if we were all Deathwing Knights, there is still an element of stat check about this army. It does have lots of other nuance to it. It's not just, I'm going to run at you, done. There is more to it, and there is a lot, as I say, more nuance behind your strategy. However, I think that core stat check, that if your opponent's army fails, you're just going to win anyway. It eliminates some of those early tournament fears, particularly especially in those early rounds where maybe it's a little bit more random. It tends to be that TOs put in some slightly spicy missions early on as well, particularly if you're playing WTC. I know that I'm playing Supply Drop round 1 at a tournament I'm at this weekend, so interesting. But that's straight from the WTC pack, so it's not uncommon. But those spicy missions tend to go first because they want to try and keep those quote unquote fairer missions for when people who are likely to be more of a similar skill get matched up against each other. So it's really very good if you can have some element of stat check where maybe if you go against something super rogue, instead of being caught out by this rogue army because you've tailored to sort of deal with the meta, your stat check then steps up and deals with that issue. So that's really why I think you should play Stormlance Dark Angels, and that is ultimately, they're my reasons. That's why I enjoy this list, and I think there's an absolute plethora of them. So next, let's talk a little bit more about pressure. So I've had a lot of people coming to me and going, hey, I want to see your deployment. Is there any way that I can see your games, etc., etc.? Unfortunately, no, there is no way that you can see my games. I don't stream games. I will if I have to at tournaments, but it's not really my thing. I like to kind of focus and mess around with my opponent and not have to worry about entertaining people on camera as well, like I do now. I love doing this, but it's different when I'm focusing in on a game, especially if that was a very close game where I really need to concentrate and really amp up what I'm thinking, how I'm, responding to what my opponent's doing, etc., etc. However, let's try and break it down a little bit more, and we're going to talk about that pressure element. So I think you'll have probably heard me say in previous videos, I start everything on the board. And that stays the same in Stormlance because I'm going, right, how can I leverage the maximum number of units as fast as possible, and how much can I scare my opponent into positions that I want them to be in so that I can get that early board dominance. And that's where that logic comes from. So how do I build into that game plan? A lot of the time I will look for the safest but closest to your opponent's deployment zone area to stage my Deathwing Knight. So if you're looking at UKTC, that is often at the L in the center of the board. That is in the, Crucible of Battle one. That's behind the paper strip. Still kind of figuring it out at WTC, but equally, by the looks of things, the way that WTC is and that those really tight firing lines, it's kind of intuitive to know where you need to deploy so that you can get that good staging area to push up with those Deathwing Knights. So definitely make sure that you are putting them in as most aggressive position as possible, but as safe as possible. I really like the games where I'm able to put all 15 of them together as well, because ultimately it leans into that stat check of if I throw these down your throat and beeline for your home objective, how can you handle that? What do you have to do to stop me from doing that? And that brings us to point 2, which is interrupting your opponent's game plan. It's very important with this Stormlance list that you it's very important with the game of 40k full stop to sort of deploy your game plan. You built your list to do your game plan. So playing your opponent's game plan is a surefire way to give them an advantage. And the best way to avoid that is to interrupt their game plan with pressure. Now, you want to try and ask as many questions of your opponent as possible. Really get them considering what their actions needs to be, otherwise they're under threat, which is where that pressure element really pushes in. If they're thinking, what happens if he rolls a bunch of 6s on advances and then suddenly he's right in my lines with all 15 of those Deathwing Knights and I'm in real trouble? it's just putting that seed into your opponent's mind. Here is my potential threat range. Here is what I can do in these areas. And you don't need to be like saying, oh yeah, no, I'm going to do, I can go X amount of inches and ruin your day or there. No, you don't need to say that. You just demonstrate it with your positioning, because otherwise, why would you take such an aggressive position if you could not leverage that aggressive position? And this list is very good at leveraging those aggressive positions and taking advantage of luck. Now, that's why I prefer Stormlance over Gladius, because ultimately Stormlance is able to take advantage of luck a lot more than Gladius is, because it doesn't have to declare when it's going to advance a charge. So if you just so happen to roll a 6 on an advance, it's going in. If suddenly JPIs just go 18 inches, great, you're ruining your opponent's day pretty damn quick. It's those examples that I think, just for me, elevate this kind of strategy of interrupting your opponent's game plan and sort of applying that pressure. Now, a key area to also apply pressure is their expansion objective. That's why I am so high on Azrael plus 5 assault intercessors, because as a skirmish unit, a little bit later in the game, obviously you want to get your value from the CP economy first, but Azrael being 11 OC in that unit is really good at just either stopping your opponent from messing around on your objective, or just interrupting their expansion objective, applying that pressure and getting them a little bit nervous. So I really like that ability, just to kind of get up there, cause some issues, and keep interrupting them on that objective. JPIs are another one that are very, very good at doing that, because obviously they can move very quickly, very efficiently. They do those impact mortals, and then they just so happen to have a power fist in there as well. Yawn. So it's really quite handy if you use those kinds of ideas to build that sort of mental advantage over your opponent, as well as that board advantage, especially on that expansion, because the more primary you can deny, the more that your opponent will feel that they need to catch up, and the more they are likely to sort of go for a slightly dodgy call. And if they go for a slightly dodgy call, you're playing the right detachment to be able to punish them, because once they've made that slightly dodgy call, that's when 15 Deathwing Knights really, really shine. So that's kind of how you should approach the pressure game with this list. Next, I wanted to take a bit more time in terms of how you leverage the shooting, because whenever people send me lists, a lot of the time the first thing they've cut is the predators, or the shooting element, so that they can fit in, more combat units like Inner Circle Companions, or some other like kind of cool, quirky unit that is very good in combat, but doesn't actually contribute enough to the overall game plan to be more efficient than that Predator. So I wanted to kind of break that down. Now, the reason that I opt for Predators and Ballistas over maybe a few fewer Vindicators, because obviously Vindicators are really nasty on their damage output. However, the reason that I go for the cheaper and slightly less killy options is because of their range. Ultimately, I'm able to outrange most relevant guns in the game that can threaten those Deathwing Knights. And if I can't outrange them, I can probably match them with that 48-inch range, especially considering the way that most gun lanes work on UKTC, WTC. There's unlikely to be many situations where you're able to get a line to something and you're more than 48 inches away from it. I think there's a couple of examples on UKTC, particularly with like the X lanes that they have on like Search and Destroy and things like that. But they are few and far between. That 48 inches is incredibly relevant for just sort of keeping your opponent honest, like I was talking about earlier. Now, the logic behind your target selection is really important for these units. It's to get a little mental advantage over your opponent, eliminating some of their nasty threats at range. Just sort of gets in their head a little bit, because they were probably banking on that to be relevant later on, or they were banking on it to try and pull units out of position from your battle plan. But because you have that range and you have those efficient tanks, you can go, actually, no, I don't need to worry about that. I'm just going to delete that with a Predator, no problem. Which was really good. And I mean, the first time I saw that, it was actually Louis that was doing that. And he was using the Predator Destructors. And he kept on using them just to snipe out key scoring units on a very open map. This was round 6 of Coventry. So really super open map with some really horrible lines. And he was just using it just to kind of like warp talons, for example, just picking them up and threatening sort of those units that could score me early game, build that board presence, build that points score that I needed to do as the Chaos Space Marine player. So that's why I really like that long range and that selection logic. Not only does it sort of work for picking off those units that can help your opponent score, it's also very important for dealing with threats that you don't want to put your Deathwing Knights into. So the Predators offer this nasty pounding strength that can just delete most elite infantry. And you look at certain infantry and you just need to get rid of it. And the Predator Destructor is just exceptional at that. The Ballistas and the Sponson Las Cannons are also very good at dealing with those bigger threats. So just making sure that you're point, click, delete with those units. That's why there's 3 of them, just because I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And it keeps up that pressure. It keeps your opponent honest in terms of their positioning. It punishes units that they don't position well in terms of units that might be scary to those Deathwing Knights. And finally, and I think most importantly, it disrupts your opponent's game plan again. It stops them being in all the positions that they want to be. As I keep saying, it keeps them honest. I've kind of broken down the range of your shooting threat already. Vindicators do get an honourable mention. I personally don't play them in Stormlance, and I wouldn't recommend playing them right now. In the Gladius version, I think they do a very different job, and fair enough, they are again a more frontline threat that you might rapid ingress in or just bring on from reserves, have a nice shooting lane, and bang, pick up a target. You can't really do that as much with this Dark Angels list because it is a lot more focused on that combat element, and you need your shooting to do that job that I've kind of just broken down in terms of leveraging that range to keep your opponent honest. Now finally, the efficiency around your gun lanes is very important. Being able to understand where your opponent wants to be and threatening that with a gun that they cannot then touch is just gold dust. The ability to just go, I'm staying this number of inches away from you. There is no way that your army can get within range of this particular tank, and therefore it is covering that objective. That kind of logic is really going to screw with your opponent. Because at that point, what can they do? They expose themselves and they go into what is a very efficient shooting platform, or they stay back and they let you score. There's so many different things that can really just cause your opponent to make more decisions and more likely to make the wrong decision. But alongside this, and I really like this element with this Stormlance list in particular, and we're going to talk about this I can't remember if it's the next slide or the slide after. I think it's next slide. But thinking about where those Deathwing Knights are going to push forward and how you're going to cover them so that, let's say, they push, they hit, then they get hit back. Now, on average, there's very few units that can pick up Deathwing Knights in their entirety. All 15 of them, I mean. So then you will get the opportunity to fall back and recharge them. Which is really handy when they're suddenly backed up by 3 Predators just going bang. And that's exactly how I dealt with a Death Guard army recently, where I put 15 Deathwing Knights in the middle. I knew he was trying to bait me, but I was like, actually, that's my plan. So I'm going to let you have the centre. Here's 15 Deathwing Knights in the middle, and then I am going to crossfire you with 3 Predators. And it picked up all of his Terminators and caused several issues, which just gave me complete board control of the flanks. And on that particular mission, which I think was Linchpin, I was able then to fall back and get his home objective, forcing Mortarion to go backwards. So there was just so many positives about losing those Deathwing Knights in that moment, because they dragged my opponent into this nasty crossfire where I was then able to pick up quite a lot of units, where otherwise it would be very difficult to deal with those units at close range. Again, going back to that, what are these tanks shooting? Right, let's talk a little bit more about that. Mitigating the counter. So we've kind of touched on that understanding of acceptable losses and positioning the fight where you want it, but I want to break that down a little bit more. But I'm going to start with the using a reactive move. The reason that we play Stormlance currently, not only because of the detachment rule, is the flat 6-inch, obviously 5-inch for Deathwing Knights, reactive move. It's great, especially in a combat army. The ability to just sort of get yourself into a position to then drop behind a wall and go, well, come at me then. And just stop your opponent leveraging that shooting threat if they want to get into those positions that they want to be. There's so many things that this just really messes with your opponent's mental maths, because do they try the 9-inch charge? It's above average, and even if they've got a reroll available, it's still above the 50% mark by 1%, but it's still above the 50% mark. So you're putting those ideas in your opponent's head. You're forcing them to think about all of these different things that you could do, which is then giving them a lot more to work with, a lot more that they have to think about from your army, which is then pushing them into that reactive mindset, which is really key. And once they're in their reactive mindset, you go up about 15 to 20% chance to win. So using that reactive move, ironically, to be proactive is incredibly useful. Really nice on terrain where, like, maybe you've got, a great example I had, I used Azrael and his assault intercessors to go out, pick up a unit of flayed ones and secure an objective. My opponent responded by going, right, here's a Catan, and I'm going to charge you in a second. And I went, cool, I'm going to reactive move back behind this wall. Nice. And it's like, perfect. Okay, opponent can't do anything then, I guess. And that worked out really quite nicely. So, those kinds of tricks can just absolutely break your opponent's back. And when they have to go for it, being able to go, don't forget my reactive move. And also you should definitely say, don't forget my reactive move, because don't be a dick. Remind your opponent you have a reactive move. Because they do need to take that into account. And not reminding your opponent is a hell of a feels bad. So don't be a dick. Remind your opponent of your reactive move, and make sure that they are fully aware of that reactive move. We play by intent. We play nicely. But yeah, so reactive move, very, very useful. Then let's go on to the positioning. We've talked a little bit about positioning in that last example against Death Guard, which is obviously a very poor matchup for Dark Angels. But in terms of where you want those fights, and this is where JPIs and scouts come into their own, they can kind of initiate that skirmish fight and drag units into areas that traditionally they don't want to fight in. And ultimately that is kind of in your opponent's third of the board that is not near any objectives. Nowhere so that they can then consolidate onto an objective, etc., etc., and leaves them out ideally in the open. Now, this isn't a surefire thing. Not every opponent will sort of commit resources to try and deal with that skirmish unit. But equally, the threat of a potential scoop behind their back line from a JPI or just scout jailing them can cause real issues. So it's definitely worth bearing in mind that these are the kinds of things that can really help to bully your opponent. And at that point, they're going to probably be quite sad because they're fighting in areas of the board that they don't want to be fighting in, so they're either going to get shot by those predators or they're just not scoring points. And the more that you're holding them in the positions that you want them, and the more that they can't have that free agency to move where they want to, the less likely they are to score those points. Finally, understanding those acceptable losses. Very, very important, because you are going to lose models, and understanding in that moment, can I sacrifice this unit? Is that acceptable? Is very important. So again, going back to that Death Guard example, I lost 10 Deathwing Knights, and it could have been more in a single turn because of Mortarian's aura for removed modifiers, and then I think it was nine odd Terminators with a Nasty Lord and Typhus, all crashing into me, and it's 2 units just gone, and one of them was shot to pieces by predators, and then another one was just slaughtered in combat, and then luckily Mortarian just bounced off the other ones because apparently I could roll 4-ups for days that day, and literally none of them died, which was quite funny. But they could have all died. Is that acceptable? It's difficult to say. All 15, I think I would have been a little bit more in trouble. I had banked on between 8 and 13 dying, just having enough left to kind of annoy my opponent's objective at the back, which is what I ended up actually doing with the Death Three Knights that survived. Obviously, a 5-man is a lot... Well, I say a 5-man is a lot more efficient. They did absolutely nothing when they got back there. They just bounced off a Predator because he made a lot of armor saves, which, I guess was karma. But I dragged my opponent into that position where I can then leverage my guns, and also he's only on that one objective in the center, not really doing anything, not really going anywhere, has no real way to rebuild that board presence because he's only got a 4-inch move. So all I have to do is stay 16.1 inches away from him, keep shooting, and those Terminators are doing nothing. So those kinds of little tricks are really key at just making sure that you're skirmishing efficiently with your opponent, understanding those acceptable losses, and sometimes that is your Death Wing Knights, and understanding when you can commit to those acceptable losses. All right, let's break down the list by unit. So first of all, we've got Azrael and his Assault Intercessors. So I've touched on these guys already. They are really good at either securing your expansion objective or skirmishing the opponent's expansion objective later in the game because of their high OC, because of their 4-up invuln, and because Azrael is ridiculously good in combat. So that's kind of their role. That's the game plan that they want to deliver. Combi Lieutenant, he is a nice little scoring piece. He's a lone op, which is dead handy. And then he does other nice things. Scores. He gives you another reactive move. He makes the army a little bit more efficient. When you have 15 Deathwing Knights all fighting on that objective where you're rerolling ones to wound, it's very, very nice. So, there's a lot to it when it comes down to that particular. I really enjoy the damage output that he can cause. He's another little grenade threat. He's another infiltrate threat. He's another just really solid scoring piece. So Combi Lieutenant, that's his job. Intercessors, they're obviously stickying your objective on the backfield. But the reason that we're going for Intercessors rather than something like Infiltrators is because in the later game, they can push forward, they can advance, they can charge, they can shoot because they've got Assault. So they're just upping the damage output that they can potentially bring. And also in a pinch, they're really not very bad as a horde clearance. Once your opponent's all on the board, they can start getting a bit busy, start being nasty. And if they can get to a second objective after stickying home, all the better, because that's 10 OC of Space Marines that your opponent has to kill, which is really quite handy if they're shooting, especially late game when it's limited resources left and they're shooting intercessors rather than, say, the remnants of a DWK squad or a Predator Destructor. That's a very positive thing to happen. Next, we've got the 3x5 DWK. They are the stat check. Get them into combat, get aggressive with them, force your opponent to handle them, because then you'll understand when those losses are acceptable. Because if you lose all 15 Deathwing Knights but you lose them turn 4 or 5 because you've already won the game and because you pressured them so hard, it does not matter. Ultimately, most of the sort of tighter games that I win, all of my Deathwing Knights are dead, but they've managed to force my opponent into a position that they didn't want to be in, and they've lost because of that. Next, we've got the 3 Predators. Very, very simple. I've talked a lot about that target priority and that shooting advantage that they bring, so I'm not going to bore you more on that. Then we've got the 3x5 JPIs, the Incursors, and the Scouts. So Incursors are to make the Predators a little bit more efficient early game, and to just give an extra little bit of anti-tank for very little, because in some ways I get a little bit worried going into tanks with this list. But there's enough mortal wound output for it between JPIs, grenades, and the Incursors, and then the last cannons. Obviously not mortals, but still basically just nasty to tanks. And then obviously the knights themselves. But they are my skirmish forces. What they are doing is they're helping me build that board control, screen my opponent off the board. But when I say screen my opponent off the board, I mean make them drop in their deployment zone. If your opponent is a nasty deep striking army and they're forced to drop in their deployment zone, they're screwed. So bear that in mind. How are you dealing with those particular armies that are putting lots in reserve? You're stopping them from coming on where they want to come on. And if you don't have to fight those points, but you stop them from coming on the board, you've killed them for a hell of a lot fewer resources than you would usually need to. Honestly, one of the best ways to just deal with your opponent, especially when they come in from strat reserve. So just make sure that you're screening efficiently with them. You're disrupting your opponent's game plan. Maybe you're move blocking, maybe you're threatening their expansion objective, maybe you're even threatening their home objective with JPIs. There is so much that these little units can do. They can punch up, they can drag opponents' meaningful units into those positions where suddenly they get ambushed by those 15 Death Wing Knights and there's nothing they can do. So that's the list, that's the logic. I hope you found it really useful. Just going to do a little roundup of our sponsors. So go like us on Facebook, Instagram. You can join the Discord. You can join my Discord, which is Angelus Mortis Discord. Sorry. It's all good fun stuff. If you want to buy your Dark Angels for a lovely cheap amount, you can go to Glasshammer Gaming and use the code BLACKCROW to get 5% off. I'm actually playing for Glasshammer Gaming this weekend, so I'm playing with Manny Chima and Dan Bates, where if you're sort of big in the competitive scene, you'll probably know those chaps. And I'm also playing with David, who does all of their streams, and Gareth Jones. So really excited to get into playing with those guys. We've got our round one. We're very, very excited. And I'm going all the way to Cardiff from Norwich. So very, very exciting. And then you can also get some lovely bespoke terrain from Terrain Forge. You can use the code BCG5 to get 5% off there. You can also become a super fan here, or you can join my Patreon, which is Angelus Mortis. And I like to kind of post little list updates. Basically, it's what I'm doing on the toilet. I make a list and I go, I'll throw it on Patreon. So it's quite good fun. Just if you want to see those spicy little lists that I build just for a bit of fun, or if you want to have a bit more, well, if you want to say good job for doing this series as well, like I appreciate it massively. It helps me do more content. Basically, all of the money that I make from either the coaching, which is another thing I do, which you can book on my website, angelusmortis.co.uk, the Angelus-Mortis. All of that money is used so I can play more Warhammer. So I can go to more tournaments because, unfortunately tournaments aren't cheap, but I'm not playing my tiny violin. I'm in a massively advantaged situation, but just so you know where your money is going, it is going so that I can go to the likes of Cardiff and play in that team's event. I'm really hoping that eventually it will mean that I can go to the States and play over there. I'm particularly looking at LVO at some point. But there's a few different tournaments that I'm very keen to get to in the States. And I'm sort of, that's probably not a this year job, but hopefully maybe it's a next year job. But if you do decide to join the Patreon or you do decide to book some coaching sessions, that is what your money is going on. I like to kind of reinvest it in my abilities. So I really hope you've enjoyed the episode. I really hope it's been useful, kind of giving you that image of my mindset and how I like to play. But most importantly, stay loyal, fuckers. And we'll see you in the next one. Cheers, guys. Bye.